From agility in teams, we now move on to a critical area in fostering a high-performing team, that of psychological safety. To discuss this with us today, we have Zoe Cunningham, a director of Softwire and Tech UK, speaking to Sally Lait, the head of engineering at Farewill. Over to you.
Hello. And
Hello.
welcome to this. Hello, Sally. Welcome everyone to this Fireside chat with Sally Lait. We will be, as previewed, we'll be discussing psychological safety. First, I have housekeeping, so the session will be recorded. And please feel free to ask the questions at any time throughout the chat in the chat section that is on your right. And we will then answer those in a Q&A at the end, or probably as soon as they come in, because I always like to get onto questions from the audience when we have them. Sally is the head of engineering at Farewill, who have the fascinating and important mission to change the way the world deals with death, which is super exciting. And actually, I wish we could talk about that, but we're going to talk about psychological safety instead. And they are currently hiring engineer managers and engineers. And Sally previously worked at Monzo, ran a digital transformation business, as well as being a head of technology on the agency side, and a dev, and loads of other stuff. So welcome, Sally.
Thank you very much for having me. Really, really excited to have this chat. This is one of my favourite things to talk about.
Amazing. Well, can you start us off then maybe by telling us what is psychological safety for people who haven't come across the term before?
Absolutely. I think it's really important that we have kind of a base understanding. So very happy to do that. So we probably all understand the concept of physical safety, you know, how our body feels in certain situations and things like that. But psychological safety is very much about feeling like you can be accepted and respected, and like you're able to act or be just generally in a way where you feel safe from any kind of negative consequences or repercussions. So things like, you know, worrying about your reputation, worrying about your job security, making sure that you feel like your prospects generally aren't threatened, stuff like that. And it is often tied into this concept of kind of, you know, if you have more autonomy, if you're in a situation where you're taking more risks, feeling safe when that doesn't go so well. But it sort of also comes back to this idea of just being. It's important for people to feel like they can be psychologically safe when they turn up at work in the morning, that they can belong, they can do well, they can, you know, be vulnerable when they need to as well. And it's been the subject of just a ton of studies around things like high-performing teams in particular. So notably, there have been studies by Professor Amy Edmondson and Google, but there's lots out there if you do want to read up on this later.
Fantastic. So I think my next question is why is it important? And some of that, obviously, I think we can see just from the explanation that you gave of what it is. But maybe why is it important for engineering teams?
Yeah, sure. So I think that when you start looking into this, you naturally get a ton of kind of what I would describe as very business-centric arguments for this. So, you know, I've mentioned high-performing teams already, and that is obviously a fantastic reason for an engineer or an engineering team to want to introduce psychological safety into the mix. But in one study, which I think was from 2017, they actually did a review of lots of different literature out there, and they called out benefits being things like improving the likelihood that process innovation is going to be successful, or increasing the amount that people will learn from mistakes, in boosting employee engagement and improving team innovation. And you can imagine that in the engineering context, these are all really desirable things. You know, we want this for our engineering team. But I would very much kind of see these as secondary factors personally, because in my somewhat idealistic view, it's important because this is just to be human. You know, it's to be kind to the people around you. It's to want to build workplaces where you can help all kinds of people exist. So if I was going to ask you, you know, Zoe, if you wanted to come into work somewhere every day where you felt like there was some kind of spectrum between mild sort of annoyance or, just that feeling you didn't fit in, through to any moment your boss could destroy your career or your mental well-being. I can't imagine you would want that. So for me, the most important factor is about people. But then that naturally leads into these really important knock-on effects, essentially. So if people feel like, as an engineer, they can bring their full self to work with all that comes from, being a messy and sometimes different human being, you will end up with all of these better outcomes and hopefully better, better products, better retention for your team, better innovation, and all that good stuff too.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I talk a lot about kind of like happiness in the workplace, and I say exactly the same thing, right? Why wouldn't you want to be happy in the workplace? Right? And then you perform better. That's amazing. So have you got any examples maybe from your career or teams you've worked with where either the presence of psychological safety has led to some amazing results that you wouldn't have expected otherwise, or maybe the opposite, that the absence of psychological safety caused teams a problem?
I knew this was going to come up. So when I was putting in some prep for this talk, I was thinking about examples I could give. And initially I was thinking about exactly that. So using examples that have happened, things that have happened to me, good and bad. And I think this sprung to mind because I actually have a really brilliant example of how some things have happened recently, and the folks at Farewill, it's still being, a very new job to me. They've made me feel extremely psychologically safe. And that was kind of what sprung to mind. But then I realized that actually, I didn't feel fully psychologically safe within this forum, because what you're going to get when you're kind of, in this sort of situation is, hello, everybody listening in, but I don't fully, I don't know you. I don't know your motivations. We don't have any kind of like base understanding or anything like that. So what you're going to get is probably kind of, more of a guarded answer to this question than if we were in a situation where we had full psychological safety. So I think this in itself is an example, basically. And this kind of situation plays out, around the world every day on video calls and in offices one day, maybe, where people don't feel safe. You don't get the full story. You don't get the best situation that you could get. But I will give you some examples to actually answer your question. So I think if somebody is going to work in an environment where they don't feel like they're included, they don't feel like they belong, for whatever reason, maybe it's everything from you have a CTO who's verbally abusive to people and very unpredictable, or you have microaggressions, or, you've got a culture where if people don't work weekends, they're going to get fired. Those people are going to be miserable and will probably ultimately leave. And what you really need to bear in mind here is that that's unlikely to be isolated as well. So if you've got one person, you've likely got other people who are feeling that too. So that's kind of like the first step of just, does somebody belong? Do they feel included? But if you can get past that point, you can get to the point where, are people safe to learn? So if people don't feel like they can ask questions, if they don't feel like it's acceptable to learn, they're going to be slower. They're going to probably not ask, get stuck and not ask for help and not know where to go. And it's probably going to make them more likely to give up. And this kind of thing plays out a lot when we talk about things like online learning communities and how we can make those safe for people to learn, in particular. And the next thing I'd call out is when people aren't safe to contribute or challenge. So if this is the case, then you're possibly going to end up with worse products. You might also make mistakes. And we sometimes see this when products get released, and there's a lot of, outcry because it doesn't work for a particular demographic or has some huge oversight. And very often we just assume that, there were no women in the room or no, whatever in the room. And maybe those people were, but maybe they just felt incredibly unsafe or not able to contribute or challenge for whatever reason. And so you have all of these kind of, situations where ultimately you won't get the best outcomes if people don't feel safe. But there are lots of knock-on effects too, because say somebody is not contributing, they're not putting their hand up and they're not visibly challenging. And these are all qualities that you value in your, in your engineering team or your workforce. Then you're probably going to get a really skewed version of the type of people that are getting promoted, for instance, because they haven't been seen to take part. So it's not just about what happens kind of in the moment. It's what can happen as a result of that too.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Sally. We're getting questions coming in thick and fast now. I think this is a topic that it's just everyone is starting to realise how important this is, and I think everyone wants to get better. So I love this question, and I would also like to know the answer to this first question. How would you measure the psychological safety of a team? Is there a way to measure it?
I think there are lots of different factors that can contribute to this. So there are tons of kind of things that we can do in a really practical sense. And so I've seen, some of the questions are around what we can actually do to make this better and how you build it. Part of that, I would say, is kind of measuring where you're at already. So I think there are lots of different tools you can use around this. The really obvious one is to sort of ask people how they are doing, but depending on the level of safety that you have in place, people might not feel safe to answer that accurately, that, they might not feel able to be honest. So you might want to do things like bring in facilitators, and those might even be external to your business. So at Farewill, we've actually got an in-house coach called Carl, who often helps us with things like that. But I do know people have brought in, external people to actually run workshops and things like that. And you might also want to do things like team health checks. So in my previous role, we would run health checks for the teams within my part of the business, and it would ask about things like, whether you feel able to sort of just generally be yourself, whether you feel able to contribute, whether you feel like you're heard, whether you feel like your role is clear. I've got a really good blog post that James, one of the people I used to work with, has written, so I could link that somewhere afterwards. But him and a person called Lucilla did some fantastic work on that. So I think asking the right questions can be very powerful to help you measure it. Absolutely.
Fantastic. And the place to look is your blog post, which I'm sure Andy can find a way to share via CTO Craft somehow.
Yeah, well, it's James's blog post, but I'll try and share it.
Yeah. So when joining a new team or a new company as a leader, how can you build psychological safety? And I suppose one of the things that's implicit in joining somewhere new is you want to do this quickly, presumably. So how do you build psychological safety as quickly as possible?
Yeah, and this is kind of, the big question, I suppose. So I only joined Farewill at the start of October, and I'd say we're starting from a pretty good starting point. So I haven't had to kind of, jump in and put out huge fires. But there are tons of little things that you can do. So this isn't all or nothing. You don't have to kind of, just jump to the end. You can build it up. So there's a lot online that can help with this, and I would recommend that people do look into it further as well if they are interested. But I'll say the first thing is to talk about it really openly and state your intentions. And also, as a leader, try to not only talk about it, but model what that means. So try to show some vulnerability, show people how it's okay to act. And I'd also say tie that in as soon as you can to other people doing that as well. So think about things like management training for inclusive management and what that actually means. So, get something out there that other people can help you with as well. And I'd say another really easy thing to do quite quickly is to state what may seem obvious. So whenever there's a situation that comes up where people might feel unsafe, think about how you can mitigate that. So we have just finished wrapping up our engineering progression framework. And of course, when you're talking about people's levels, people's salaries, people's futures, that is just inherently quite a worrying and unsafe time for people. So call that out. Talk about what people should do if they feel unsafe, and give people the tools to support other people as well. There's lots of examples that I could give of this. So, I've recently asked a manager to take on something which is arguably like a stretch, like quite a big stretch for them. And we've had that conversation around what happens if this all goes really wrong? We've talked really honestly about that. So I think there's a question in the chat about kind of, comfort versus license to fail indefinitely. I don't think this is about people just, having free rein to do whatever they want and it's always fine, whatever happens. I think it's just about being super clear on what those expectations are, where the lines are, what is going to happen, what isn't going to happen, and crucially being really consistent with that. Because if you tell everybody, oh, there's no consequences, and then there are consequences, that will just absolutely make people feel completely unsafe further down the line. But if you say, if this happens, there are no consequences. If this happens, this is what we're going to have to do about it, but be really open about that. People understand better, and they really sort of, they have that clarity and that transparency to know what to do. So I think those are kind of like the most urgent bits, but then otherwise I would suggest what we've talked about, gathering the data. And then I'd suggest some more long-term things as well, like actively trying to work to build a diverse company, trying to train people on these kind of topics, and also just generally kind of give the people around you an opportunity to see each other as humans as well, to build those relationships, because that can really help some of the topics that I've mentioned, about being able to be vulnerable, being able to share. That is very much easier to do if you've got some kind of base relationship.
Fantastic. So clarity, consistency, what you say corresponding with reality. So not turning out that you said something totally different, and interacting with people as humans and finding a way to foster that. I think those are all super great tips. So should we talk a bit more about psychological safety versus comfort versus license to fail indefinitely? I wonder whether, to me, this feels like a little bit pointed, that perhaps the question asker is worried about whether you're signing a blank check with psychological safety and you're saying, oh, well, you can't ever say anything to upset me because it will damage my psychological safety. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that one of the misconceptions about this is that it's a bit sort of fluffy and a bit intangible and is very much kind of about mollycoddling people and all of that. And actually that's not the case. So when you think about things like feedback, or lots of people want environments that practice radical candor, or are very performance oriented, none of those go against the idea of psychological safety at all. In fact, I think having a foundation where people do feel psychologically safe sets those up much better, because that actually when feedback is coming, it's in an environment where people do feel safe to receive it. They have the tools and are equipped to deal with it and things like that. And so actually, I think I'm yet to come across an environment where anybody's said what you said about kind of, oh, you can't say that to me, it's making me unsafe, unless they are actually feeling unsafe, in which case there's a problem and that should probably be addressed. I think if you've got a sort of environment where people are finding excuses to not have a conversation or not receive feedback or whatever it might be, and aren't genuinely feeling unsafe, but are using, sort of putting up walls, making excuses, things like that, then that's a different problem to break down. Obviously, if they are genuinely feeling unsafe, that in itself is a problem to break down. But I think the concept of psychological safety isn't just some kind of magical escape route for people to get out of by just invoking at any point. I hope that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, and actually, kind of back to the question, it's not necessarily about comfort, right? It is actually about being able to say what you and engage with the workplace and be able to, I mean, for me, I kind of see it almost as being able to actually operate and do your job rather than having all these hidden issues that are going to get in the way without anyone knowing what they actually are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Okay. All right. So what if psychological safety is totally unknown to a business? You've joined a new company, no one knows what psychological safety is. What kind of things do you need to do first? How would you start implementing it?
Great questions. So I think when I talked before about kind of stating the intent and, talking through your own intention that this is something that we want to move towards, the step kind of before that might be learning enough. If you're not familiar with this at all, if it is completely an alien concept, as the question phrases it, you might not feel like you've got the toolkit to kind of implement anything. So I'd suggest starting with yourself, learning a little bit, looking at what has and hasn't worked in other places, and maybe asking for advice is always a really great starting point. I'd also say to try to build up, rather than kind of going in and then suddenly announcing, we're going to do this wonderful thing, and you haven't actually told anybody. Building up a bank of kind of allies who can come on that journey with you and be really supportive is very, very powerful. So if you could, if you could basically kind of get everybody bought in, right up to CEO level, that's going to be a much more powerful starting point than just coming in and you're sort of speaking to people who have absolutely no concept of why this is important. So lay some of those foundations first, I'd suggest. And then I'd say just do some of those things that I talked through before in terms of starting to kind of make some easy wins, starting to talk about it in different forums, starting to be really explicit and be consistent. But also I'd say if you are coming from a place where people feel extremely unsafe, or this is a completely new concept and you're fundamentally changing an operating model of what people are used to, there may be suspicion, there may be resistance. Some of these questions of, well, does this mean we can, just cite psychological safety whenever we don't like something? You might need to actually overcome people just, again, not having enough information or context of what this means, and they might just not believe you. If you're coming into somewhere and saying you're not going to be fired for saying this stuff, but then people have been fired for maybe sharing views or challenge in the past, that's very difficult to change. So it very much does depend on kind of the environment that you're coming into and the willingness to go on that journey. But building some of your own tools up and bringing other people on that journey to help be your band of cheerleaders will really help you in that situation.
Brilliant, thank you. And we are getting near the end of the session, but I want to try and power through as many of these questions as possible. Any tips on building psychological safety in a remote environment, which obviously so many people are in now?
Yeah, so this is slightly different from if we were all very office based. Going back to my point of getting to know people as people, very often that kind of turns into let's go and do fun activities together and let's hang out and chat and grab lunch or go for a coffee and go for a walk. But there is a lot more to this, and so I think it naturally does tie in quite well to some of the concepts that help you work well remotely anyway. So when I've been talking about being very explicit, that translates very well to the written form of you can literally preface things that you write by saying that I want to be super clear, this is the case, this is what you should be feeling, this is what you should be doing, and this is the intention. There's a slight tangent that's just come into my brain of a very particular video game where actually, sorry, this is a very weird tangent, but in that there was some characters that basically sort of expressed emotion through text, and so the concept of what they were speaking was always prefaced by kind of happy, and then they would say it because everything was spoken in a monotone. And I sometimes think of that when we are purely email based, or sometimes purely Slack based, things like that. So I'd say when you're doing it remotely, try to be super clear, try to make sure that you are doing things visibly, that you're not letting anything get lost in translation for, expecting that there's pre-existing knowledge or pre-existing relationships or things like that. And just tie it into the other kind of relationship building and the work that you're doing around working better remotely anyway.
Brilliant. Okay, I think we've got time for one final question. So what, in your experience, do people most often get wrong about psychological safety?
Okay, well, I'll try and leave the niche video game examples out of this one, but I think one of the things that people get wrong is, I mentioned one earlier. So I think it's very easy to think that it's all or nothing. It's not necessarily, it's not a box you can tick and suddenly have. I think that it's something that can get better over time, and it can also be better or worse in different parts of your company. So somebody might feel completely psychologically safe within maybe their own team, but then completely unsafe within another pocket of the company. So I'd be very careful of just blanket saying, oh, we're all very psychologically safe and have amazing high performing teams. I think another thing is just going back to the point that we talked about before of how this can work alongside other things like having great feedback and having a culture of really wanting high performance and driving people forward. It doesn't have to be against those. And I think another thing is that it's something that has to happen instantly. So you can work on it over time. It will take time depending on the situation of the company. But that doesn't mean that you can't start now with the little things. So yeah, give it a shot if you're listening to this today and thinking about it.
Fantastic. And then just final question, what's the game that you mentioned?
I mean, when I say niche, it's not niche to anybody who knows, but it's a game called Mass Effect. There was a series, and I can't remember the race of the alien species that talk like this, but I'm sure somebody out there does remember, and I will go and look it up afterwards. But yes, Mass Effect.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sally, for talking with us today. You can connect with me or with Sally after this session on the links that we will be sharing with you shortly. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoe. Really great to chat.